G'day Jaffa Adventures, Terry King here. Welcome to the channel. Well, looky what we've got here. We got the Monte SS in the shed, ready to go up on the hoist. I have got this table full of parts that I'm going to throw at this thing. You want to see what I'm going to get up to? Stick around. The first leak I'm going to address is the transmission. And to do that, I've got to take that pan off. And on these older style GM transmissions, this one's a 200R, there is no drain plug. So you either drop the pan one end at a time and sort of drop the fluid out that way, or you suck it out with a pump sucker outerer. It's a nice red color, it's not burnt, so that would suggest the transmission's been looked after. We'll be able to tell that once I pull that pan off. Alright, this is the first time I've had this baby up on the hoist. I crawled under it as best I could when I did the purchase inspection, but now that it's up in the air, we'll be able to have a real good look at what we're after. Bit of an oil leak on the front of that sump. They always leak between that timing cover and the sump. I've got a new fuel pump to whack on it. This one's working fine, but what the hell? It's up in the air. Car Request oil filter, that looks reasonably new, but I will change the oil out anyway. Transmission pan is leaking ATF. I knew that when I purchased it, so I'll pull that pan off and replace that gasket. And there's also a torque converter lockup solenoid in there, which goes on these cars quite frequently. Mine's starting to display some signs of failure. What the torque converter's doing is just locking up far too quickly. And it's also reticent or hesitant to unlock once it is locked. And it is that solenoid that's the issue. There's a little bit of rust there. It sits in between this underbody coating and the panel itself. So I'll have to clean that all up. That's probably the worst of it right there. You can see how the rust can get underneath of this body material. I'll scrape that off all the best that I can, and I'll hit that with some Lanatec, which is like a penetrating oil. The sills themselves are excellent, both the inner and the outer rockers. It's got a brand new exhaust system. Nothing too flash there. It's got a brand new fuel tank because the previous owner said he backed into something and hauled the tank. So that's awesome. But other than that one little spot of rust, it is bloody clean. Real clean. Not too shabby for a 38-year-old car. All right, let me attack that transmission next. Now, you don't need to undo this torque converter cover for this job, but mine's all grungy and shitty looking, so I'm gonna pull it off and clean it up. And these bolts are all metric, which is awesome. Okay, now for a pan. I can tell the gasket has been pushed out where the bolts go in. I can tell this has been over tightened, which is possibly one of the reasons it's leaking. Okay, now we gotta get this filter out of the road, and that just pulls straight out like so. Now, before I go snipping wires on him, I'm gonna take that out and match it up against the replacement that I've got and make sure I've got the right one. And I'll take this one wire clip out as well. Come on out, little guy. If we line where the bolt levels are, that replacement solenoid is a wee bit longer on the shaft, and the diameter looks like it's close. Let me slide it up in there and see if it goes. Yes, it indeed does fit in there. That's a good start. All right, I'll snip this guy off. Slide that wire connector back up there for later. Now I'll strip these two wires. Now, I have put those bits of wire together. I have cleaned them down with some brake cleaner, and I'm actually gonna try and solder them. They give you these Scotch lock type connectors, and worst case scenario, I'll use those. But if I can get some solder to stick to this, that's my first prize. Come on, baby, stick. I think we got her. Let me give that a little bit of a tug. Excellent. That worked. Now I've got some shrink wrap. We'll slide over these joints, shrink that down, call that done. Now they give you some replacement hardware, these little studs, and they're a little bit longer than the original bolts, which is good because it'll compensate for that little bit longer shaft here on the end. Put a little bit of carby cleaner up there, and I'll put a tiny, tiny bit of blue Loctite, because one end screws up in there, and then the bolt screws onto the other end of that stud. Tiny little bit of blue Loctite. I'll zoom those in. And of course that solenoid came out of the States, so it's in Imperial. So now I've got bloody Imperial bolts in my metric transmission. Okie dokie, up we go. Seated. Now a couple more fraction bolts to add to the equation. It's funny, I had one of the scooters over here once working on his truck, and I asked him to get me a particular spanner. And I've got metric beside the Imperial spanners, and he said, what are these ones with fractions all over them? There's a whole generation out there that haven't dealt with Imperial. It's pretty funny. There we go. All right, solenoid locked in, bolts all done up tightly. I've got a replacement transmission filter, but first I'll clean up my pan and clean up the rest of this area before I get going too far. Just cleaning up this mating surface. It's actually in pretty good shape. Just a tiny little bit of gasket around these two front bolt holes, and that was it. The rest of it came off very clean. Somebody has been into this transmission before. The gasket that was on the pan was not a genuine gasket. So I don't know what they were doing in here, but they were in here for something. All right, there's our pan all cleaned up, magnets all cleaned up, sitting in place where it needs to be. Now I'm going to put a very, very fine coat of RTV on here, and I mean fine, because what I don't want is that RTV to be spilling out into the transmission and blocking up any passages. That would be all kinds of bad. This is more or less just like a little bit of glue to hold the gasket in place more than anything else. Doesn't form a sealing function, not for what I'm doing here anyway. Is it right? Is it wrong? I don't know, but it's my way or the highway. Incidentally, whoever had this off before I did the same thing. They had a really, really, really fine coating of RTV. Pop our gasket in place, and I'll do the exact same thing to this side of the gasket. That's all siliconed up. While I let that set up for 5 minutes or so, one more job, put on our new filter. There's a trap for young players. The seal is sitting inside of the bore here. Got to dig that out. There's the old seal out. New one still on the pickup. Get a little bit of ATF, pop it on that one. Filter's all in place. Let me go grab the pen. That RTV is set up, and we can bolt this thing in place. All right, these are torqued down to 75 inch-pounds, which is like 10 Newton meters. So I don't have a torque wrench that goes that low, so I'm just doing this by hand. I got a pretty good feel of it over the years. Now, while I'm under here, I might as well drain the oil. Ooh, that plug was a bit loose. Oh, that's a wee bit black for a car that's meant to be serviced regularly. I've already cracked this filter. It is a CarQuest filter. Got myself an oil filter here. I'll just fill this one up. These are good because you can fill them because they sit in this orientation on the engine block. I remember my old Land Cruiser with the 1HZ, the filter sat the other way. Every time you took it off, it poured all over the chassis, and you could never fill it. Take some of this excess oil, just wipe over this seal a little bit. Good to go. Spin that little sucker on in place, put it on hand tight, and in 5,000 kilometers, I'll need to take that off with a filter wrench. All right, sump plug done up. filter done up, all the transmission bits and pieces done, and that little scatter shield all done. Time to drop the car down and top her up with some fluids. The specs are telling me that I should be topping it up with about 5 liters of a Dex 3. So I will go with 4 for starters, take it for a test drive and see what we got after that. I am not putting synthetic engine oil or a synthetic auto trans fluid in this thing because the lubricity of the new synthetics in these older cars actually just leaks past all the gaskets. So you're better to run the old dyno oils. Ask me how I know that. Grab our dipstick, pop him back home, and we'll move on to engine oil now. Clean my funnel out. Down the hatch we go. 20 minutes later. All right, let's kick it in the nutsack. Oil pressure up to 55 pounds. Awesome. That transmission is behaving much better now. It's not locking up too early and it's not unlocking too late. Bloody awesome. When I stand on the throttle, there's a bit of ping in the motor. I can hear that. It's still running the petrol from Canada, which from my recollection was 95. That was the maximum octane rating you could get. So I'll run a few tanks of 98 through it, see whether that takes care of the ping. And if it doesn't, then I'll have to look at retarding the timing maybe a little bit. Next system I'm going to work on is the brakes. Now I've already replaced the brakes back in Canada, so if you've got an old set of brakes, you can't import into Australia if they're an asbestos style brake. So I replaced the front brake pads and the front brake shoes, but the rubber lines are still original and they're pretty old and crusty. So I'm going to replace those rubber lines. Ooh, look at that fluid. That hasn't been changed this decade. That's nasty. All right, I dug out my Super Sucker 6000. I'm gonna get as much brake fluid out of there as I can before I top it up with fresh stuff and replace those lines. That is downright nasty, the amount of sludge that's in there. Far out. I wonder when the last time that these brakes were serviced. Okay, little buddy, time for some fresh fluid. Oh, that's good. That's real good. Okay, let me get the car in the air a little bit more and get these wheels off. And right here is a classic and why I'm replacing these lines. That one there has got a giant split in it. Hasn't started leaking yet, but it's probably not too far off. Now, let's see if I can get that sucker off without stripping it. I don't like my chances. All right, I'm gonna try and get in there with a little bit of heat first. I can see me rounding this sucker off and getting the vice grips out, that's for sure. No chance. That sucker's rounding already, I can feel it. Bit of juice. I probably should have sprayed these a week ago and let them sit, but there you go. I've got some pipe spanners, but they're in metric, not in imperial. Okay, time for Australia's favorite tool, the vice grips. Now what I don't want to happen is for that nut to catch on that brake tube and snap that brake line off. Ah, it cracked. Oh yes. Holy moly. All right, let me undo the other end. Oh, that one cracked too. You little ripper. Okay, I'm gonna get my vice grips. I'm gonna pinch this old line and I'm gonna undo the bottom of it and put my new line on before I take this off. Otherwise, what I'm trying to do is just minimize the amount of drippage on the floor. I cleaned my bolt up. I got 2 new copper washers on it and we're ready to feed our line in. I'm gonna leave this bottom one loose just a little bit. So when I hook up the top part of the line, it at least fills this line up with fresh brake fluid. All right, there's a little clip on the back side of this that holds that brake line in place. That's in there. The previous owner put all this bloody undercoat on here, and it's gooed everything up. The end of your ratchet is perfect for knocking that in. And our final tighten up at this end without stripping. And our tighten down at the bottom. Crunch those copper washers down nicely. Now I'm going to loosen off the brake bleeder and just let that air bleed down. And of course the bleeders are a 10 millimeter. So we've got a mixture of imperial and metric on the brake system. I can see this car is going to be a challenge going forward. I'm actually going to pull this bleeder out completely. Just make sure that that's not blocked. All right, I cleaned that up on the wire wheel, cleared out the passages. They were actually pretty good. So I'm just going to set this back in, not tighten it up all the way so that this can gravity bleed. I don't know why it's not pissing out already. It should be, but anyway, I'll move over to the other side and we'll start on that one. Now I'm going to do a couple of cosmetic things. I'm going to replace this windscreen washer bottle, just a little bit discolored. And when I drain the coolant, I'm also going to replace that coolant overflow tank. Once again, Chevy's kept me guessing with these bolts. These ones are 10 mil holding this sucker on. Now here's a bloody good idea from Chevy. The pump is external to this tank. So you just got a little bit of a suction tube here that draws it out. I don't know how many of these washer fluid tanks I've seen where the pump is built in and either the washer fails or the reservoir cracks and it leaks everywhere. This is such a better idea. Well done, boys. Just dig these little clips off and reuse them. Here we go. I'll save that cap for later in case this one deteriorates, but I'll use a genuine cap on that. Sweet. A wee bit of bars bugs, and then top it up with some distilled water. Done. This is the rear brake line here. This one is an absolute bitch to get to. This end is okay, it's sitting up on the diff, but that end actually runs up through the frame. And these stabilizer bars running under the diff actually get in the road. So I elected not to change that one out yet. I am going to pull these off at a later date and replace these bushes, and when I do that, that's when I'll do that brake line. So I've had Jill up here. We have bled the brakes. They are all good. Best that they've ever felt actually, which is awesome. I'm gonna move on to the diff. Now these 8-inch diffs, or the 8.5 or 7.5, I don't know. Whatever they are, they don't have a drain in them. So you've actually got to pull that back cover off. Now I don't have a gasket for that back cover, so I'm going to pull out the fill plug and I'm going to use my Suckulator 2000 to draw the fluid out of that pumpkin and then replace it back in there. And it's pretty black and nasty bloody diff fluid. I don't know when the last time this stuff was changed, but it's a while ago. The old Suckulator 2000, she's working, that's for sure. Pulled out about 1.2 liters. Now I've swapped it around and I got the Suckulator 2000 running out of this container through the Suckulator and into the diff. When it's pulling this viscosity, the pump certainly does work hard, but it gets the job done. Just takes a little bit more time. Now I'm going to replace the rear shockies on this car. I've already done this side. They're not in terrible shape, but it's all about a total renewal. What is in crappy shape are the bolts. That's the sort of shape they're in. I don't know how many times these shockies have been replaced over the last 38 years, but they don't give you new hardware. So that's probably the original Monte SS hardware. I was a little bit concerned the diff was going to drop without the tires resting on the ground, but in actual fact that triangulated rear, all those struts and braces actually hold it in place. Hello, shocky. I spoke a little bit too soon. The shocky on this side is completely cactus. I've compressed it. It's not even coming back out. And have a look at those rubbers. Perished as anything. All right, let's get the new one in. I got that little brake line replaced, and that was not easy. Why? Let me tell you. First of all, you got to get that control arm out of the road to allow you to get up there and access one end of the brake line. But to get that control arm out of the road, I had to pull out that side of the exhaust. What an absolute pain in the ass. And while you might think, hey, that exhaust would be pretty easy to pull off because it's almost brand new, you're right, except somebody has gone along with a gas axe and it burnt off the end of all of these U-bolts. So I had to go through and grind the ends off of all of these. Who even uses gas axes anymore? Far out. I do have replacement bushes for these control arms, but you know what? I'm not prepared to tackle that at this point in time. Got my new shockeys installed on both sides. Oh yeah, and I rebuilt both rear brake drums with a rattle can. Time to move on to the front of this car now, and I am going to tear into this front suspension. Although I've done this before, this isn't a how-to video, but if you want to stick around for a little bit of entertainment, let's get stuck in. First things first, I'm going to pull these shockeys off, which I believe are the original 38-year-old shockeys. And as you'd expect, the shockey is turning. All right, I got it the hard yak away. I was kind of hoping to use the power tools, but nope, not going to happen. Well, after 10 minutes on one side, we have one bolt off. Woohoo! This side was not playing nice, so I took the grinder and I chopped the end of the stud off and I cut the bolt in half. There, bolt undone. Now I'm going to take these brake calipers off and tie them up out of the road, because when I said I'm disassembling the entire suspension system, I meant it. Lower control arms, upper control arms, the spindles obviously, sway bars, everything. These G-body calipers have got these stupid 3/8 hex pins that hold the calipers in place. And this top one fouls with the upper control arm. So you've actually got to get in the car and turn the wheel to clear the control arm. As I said earlier in the video, I did these brakes over in Canada to get rid of the asbestos pads. So these pins I've cleaned up and they're actually lubricated. I'll tell you, I fought with these suckers over in Canada though. Alright, I got the caliper tucked up out of the way. That'll get in the road when I go to undo those upper control arm bolts, but that's for a future Terry problem. I'll hop over to the other side, undo that, and then get the car in the air further. Alright, let's get these shockeys out of here. Excellent, that's a bolt, so I gotta bloody try and get it from the top side. And this one on this side, however, is different. So one of these shockeys is aftermarket and the other one is original. I'm missing half a shockey still up in there. Well, that is cactus. I'd say this one's probably the aftermarket one because it's got nutserts in it. And there's the other half. That's the end I was struggling with to get that bolt off, but that end is threaded. So I would say that when I had the rattle gun on here and this whole shaft was spinning, it's probably unscrewed that at that point in time. Wonder if that's an easier trick to get these things undone. Hit them with the rattled gun, unscrew it, and take it out in two pieces. Never had that happen to me before. And there's the shockey out of the other side. I can compress that with my hand. And you know what? It actually is coming back out ever so slowly. So they're not completely cactus. I'm gonna pull the lower and the upper control arms off, replace the bushes in them. Gonna pull the sway bar off and replace all the bushes in it. Gonna pull the drag link off and all of the tie rod ends and replace all of them. So basically everything on the front suspension of this vehicle is coming off. I anticipate a bit of a fight here with some of these bolts. So to help me gain a little bit of access, first thing I'm gonna do is take off these little struts, which, I don't know, bolt the front of the frame to this cross member. Maybe it's an anti-front end wobble strut. That's what I'm gonna call it. You know, this car keeps throwing me curveballs because just when I think it's all metric, it throws an imperial bolt at me. Just checking this side versus the other side to make sure I can't mix them up. And I can't. The bend is a little bit different on them. Sweet. Add those into the parts pile to be cleaned up a bit later. Now there's the ends of the sway bar that I got to take off, and that nut has got to run up all of that crusty thread. So I think I'm going to play the smart game, get my cutoff wheel and cut off 99% of that thread, so I've only got to take it off a short little distance. These are all replaced in the sway bar kit that I've got. Shorter. Well, that was easy with a short little stud. All right, sway bar gone. Okay, now I'm gonna spend the next 6 hours and 17 minutes pulling out all of these split pins. And there's a crap ton of them. On every castle nut, there's a split pin. Except here, where we don't have a castle nut or a split pin. That's interesting. Obviously aftermarket. I make it sound a little bit more dramatic than it really is. You know, because I'm taking this off in one complete unit, I've really only got the split pins on the upper and the lower ball joints. I'll take the tie rod ends off on both sides and then knock this split pin out of this pitman arm for the steering, and that should be it. I'll be taking all of the rest off the car in one unit. The old pickle fork. Gotta love them. Got it. All right, after a good hour, here's where I'm at. I've got all those split pins out of the upper and lower ball joints. That was a nasty job. That probably took 3/4 an hour to get 4 split pins out. But anyway, they're out, and I backed each of the nuts off on the upper and the lower ball joints, just enough so that you can see 2 or 3 threads showing, and that's on both sides. I've also backed off the nuts on the lower control arm. There's 2 per side, one here, front and back on both sides. Now I'm gonna get my trusty pickle fork and wail on these and get that spindle to drop down on top of those nuts. I'm gonna do that now while I've got the coil spring in there, because that's gonna give me a little bit of help. That coil spring's under load, obviously, and it wants to force each of these ball joints out of their receptacle. So I'm gonna use that, what do they call it, kinetic energy or potential energy? I guess it's potential energy in that spring to help me crack those two. Then we'll lower the car down, take these lower control arm bolts out, slowly lower the control arm, and take all the energy out of that spring. That's one. My pickle fork's not wide enough to get around that lower ball joint, unfortunately. So I'm not gonna be able to crack that one quite yet, but that's all right. We've got one off. That's all we need to get this lower control arm out of here and get that spring out of there. All right, I got that spring compressed now, such that all the tension is off of this here ball joint. Take that nut off, and I'll slowly lower my trolley jack and try not to have this thing explode in my face. All right, that's free. Here we go. I'll get on the back side of this control arm. One coil spring. All right, now I'll just rinse and repeat on this side. Take this nut off, lower the trolley jack. Coil spring removed. Well, after literally an hour, I've got those lower control arms out. 3 of the bolts came out, no problem at all. Took all of 30 seconds. That sucker there was and is froze inside of the sleeve. So I tried bashing it, I tried heat, I tried the rattle gun spinning it out. I tried everything. Eventually I chopped the head and the tail of the bolt off and dropped it out. So I'll need a new bolt for that front of that lower control arm. Last item on the suspension, the upper control arms. What holds these upper control arms in place are 2 nuts on this cross shaft. Now, I've been soaking those suckers for the past couple of days. Let's see whether I can get those babies off. I'll have to keep track of the shim packs as well. It's pretty tight in there. I can't get any of my power tools, so gotta use the old spanner, but the bolts are coming off. So there is that. But you can only get about a 1/4 turn on them, so I'll see you in about 28 hours. Gotcha. Time to turn this crusty control arm to a fully restored piece like that. Let's do it. I got that cross shaft out, but only because the rubber was dead. So the press pushed the rubber out of the bushes. I've got that steel sleeve welded onto that end of the cross shaft, and the same welded onto the other end of the cross shaft. And I've got these 2 steel sleeves in the control arm, which I need to press out now. A lot of noise, a lot of carnage, but out she come. That's one side, on to the next. Now I've ground the heads off of all of those rivets. This was definitely a factory ball joint because it's riveted on. All the aftermarket ones are bolted. One crusty old ball joint. There. Clean it up, reassemble it, it'll look like the other one. I'm disassembling this lower control arm. This dust cap looked a wee bit dodgy. Check this out. Now there's a redneck fix. Smear a little bit of silicone on the inside of your dust cap. Pop her back on. Good as gold. Far out. I'll be replacing that one. The upper control arms were difficult. These lower control arms are an absolute pain in the ass. Trying to get these bushes out. You can't press them because they go out from that side and the whole control arm interferes with the press. I've popped a bolt in there so that this doesn't compress. I've tried to press them out using a bolt and a large socket over that end and a washer on this end to kind of press them out. That didn't work. So now I'm moving on to a hole saw and a Sawzall. So here's how I'm getting those bushes out. Chop the middle guts out of it, then these two ends pop out reasonably easily, but you need yourself a Sawzall and a bit of patience. There's one part of the equation. Here's the other part of the equation. Now, I'm not going to say that's easy or fun, but it is effective. Now I'll hit the control arms with a little bit of rust converter before I hit them with a coat of black paint. Just not going to bother mixing up a 2-pack. These control arms won't last another bushing change, so they'll be swapped out the next time bushings need to go into this car, which may not be in my lifetime.